Welcome everyone to another episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. As always, this episode comes from the teachings of our amazing friend and shaman in residence, Kriket. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts as much as we enjoy making them, and I'd like to take just a moment to ask you if you would please leave us a rating and a comment in iTunes or whichever podcast player you're listening to us from. Giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others is the biggest way you can tell us that you like our show. Now, without further ado, on with the episode.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Shaman's Way, and welcome back to our amazing podcast. Thank you for the lovely people who are writing in with their comments and their ideas. I wanted to do a podcast dedicated to my ever-beloved horse and my ever-beloved drum. So I'm going to fill your heads with just a little bit of technical information, and then I'm going to go about and discuss some of the fun I've had with horses in my journeys and perhaps what the horse might mean with respect to being a power animal. So where I want to begin is with the drumming as the basic connection. Many of us can identify with the drum, and you're here because you identify with shamanism or you identify with the sound of the drum, and maybe it was the free drumming download that got you to Shaman's Way or got you to listening to our podcast. I'm not sure, but what I want to point out is that we all began hearing the original drum. We all began hearing the original drum in our mother's womb, and the original drum was our mother's heartbeat. There have been many circles over the years that people have asked to just drum quietly in the sound of the heartbeat. I find that very calming. I actually just find the sound of the drum very calming. What the drum does is it calms us at the same time as it allows us the opportunity to open our inner awareness with the intention of exploring our inner landscape. I know some of you may be listening for the very first time, and some of you have been wonderful and amazing listeners for all of our podcasts, and I believe this is podcast number 40. I can't believe that, but I'm very excited about it. And so we are going to, just chat a little bit about the fun of the drum. One of the books that I read was When the Women Were Drummers. And I think it was by Lynn Redmond. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was. What was pointed out in that book that I wasn't aware of was the fact that many of the ancient priestesses who played the frame drums, they were also the first drummers, also functioned as oracles. It is hypothesized, and we know from our own experience, that the sound of the drum drove their brain waves into an oracular state, which they could see the past, the present, and future. So in that time, in that moment, that present moment, when we use the drum, we also go into that oracular state, and we also can travel through the past, the present, and the future, all within that present moment. Scientists have measured the rhythm of our thoughts or brain waves with an EEG, and they have labeled the vibratory rates of these. The fastest is the beta wave, which is commonly described as our ordinary type of attention. The second is our alpha state, which is relaxed meditative state. Lower still is the theta state, often known as the hypnagogic, hypnagogic state, the state between waking and sleeping. This is a time where one could have a visual and an auditory non-rational experience. The delta wave is the slowest and usually occurs when one is in deep sleep. Now, scientists have found that paranormal activity generally takes place in a lower alpha or theta state. Many times we fall asleep during journey work, and what they think and what I think too is that the brain slips too quickly between the theta and the delta states. So under the influence of an auditory driving mechanism, a rhythmic sound, so the drum beating at that monotonous 180 to 220 beats a minute, you can stay awake and interact with the unseen world around you. I find it important for me to understand that both the left and the right side of the brain have different wave patterns emanating from them. My understanding is that most of the time these brain waves are not synchronized. So generally one hemisphere is dominant from anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 hours, and then it shifts over to the other hemisphere of the brain. Interestingly, under the influence of an auditory driving mechanism, drumming, rhythmic sound ostensibly influences both hemispheres of the brain, and they can start resonating to the same rhythm. And this is where people experience paranormal capacities. Also under the influence of the drum, most people experience that oracular state that we talked about before. A mystical experience is not uncommon, and this is called the awakened brain state. I think this is why people have drummed for thousands of years. The shamanic drum is our foremost vehicle for engaging our attention and sparking the awakened brain state. I can understand most certainly how the drum is commonly referred to as a horse. That was how I was introduced to it so many years ago when I started on my shamanic path. To this part of the world, the drum is referred to a horse because it carries our awareness in such a way that we once again can communicate with spirit. For those of us who are Sami or who come from Finland, Northern Russia, Sweden, it is referred to as the reindeer because they don't have horses, and generally the raw hide that they use for their drums comes from the reindeer. It also carries their awareness in such a way that they can communicate with spirit. When I explain drumming to a Western thinking mind, I find that sometimes it's important to stress that the phenomena occurs because of an integration between the physiological and the transcendent part of ourselves. I tend to describe the monotonous beat of the drum as candy for the conscious mind, and you may have heard me refer to that either in person or through the podcast. And shamanic drumming is monotonous because we're not interested in engaging the conscious mind. Rather, we're interested in placating the conscious mind. By awakening the brain's theta state, we're inducing a dreamlike state of being. It is important to note that this state of being does not engage the conscious mind. Perhaps we could also refer to that conscious mind as the constant critic or the emotional meter. The awakening of the theta state brings us into a state of being that does not rely on emotional content, or rather, it doesn't really naturally free us from our rational brain. Oftentimes, what I hear back is the journey is certainly not what they expected. Rather, it is good when what we expect is the furthest thing from what we experience. One of the aspects of this is, I was at a Gaia gathering, which is a gathering of pagan traditions. So there are a number of pagan traditions that come together for this particular Gaia gathering, and we are having a round out discussion with respect to shamanism. I have to admit that I think I was the only shaman in the room and was speaking from a shamanic perspective, and most of the people there were witches from different traditions, a couple of heathens, and some other traditions that I'm really not 100% certain what they are. However, the reason I mention this is because there seems to be some really interesting misunderstandings with regard to shamanism within some of the larger pagan community at hand. The attempt for me to explain to the people there that in North America we have animals which show up that are not indicative of our European roots. So unfortunately, I mentioned, wolf as being a particular power animal that comes through, and immediately the person who was leading the discussion or was leading that particular round of discussion, that particular keynote speaker, what happened was that person automatically assumed that I was again bringing the European roots or the European traditions into shamanism. What I was cut off from saying, and what I'd like to say, is that many people in our circles in North America, well, I'm going to speak specifically about Edmonton and Calgary, the places where I have led drumming circles, and people have found their power animals, is that we have a large number of animals that are North American specific. Not only do we have the wolf, we also have badgers. We also have wolverines. There are also coyotes in the mix. There are otters in the mix. We have moose for power animals. One of the other things that we have quite a few of are the common ones, such as deer, such as wolf, such as eagle, such as hawk. Those are more of the common ones. And when we are in a journey, when we find a power animal, we've talked about this before in podcasts regarding power animals, what we expect is the furthest thing from what we experience. So there are many people who have the assumption that they're going to meet a wolf in their spiritual journey because they're really associated with wolves. And sometimes they don't. So sometimes they find mice, sometimes they find a wolverine, sometimes a badger, whatever the case is. If there is an uncertainty with our experience, we can then be more confident that what we're experiencing is real and more complex than simply controlling our daydreams. The journey is often referred to as an ecstatic state. In the ecstatic state, the journeyer can communicate with the unseen world to gain information that can affect the seen world. And again, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the spirit world operates independent of us and not dependent of us. The experience brought on by the monotonous sound of the drum is an individual journey into what is commonly referred to, primarily because of Michael Harner, non-ordinary reality. Therefore, experience vary from person to person and also from journey to journey. Once you enter a trance state, the rhythm or sound of the drum tends to change. The drum beat may appear to speed up or slow down, while the sound may grow louder, softer, or even disappear. Many people experience a change in body temperature, or they feel their energy flowing through the body. They find themselves twitching. If they stand while they're journeying, many times they sway. If they're sitting while they're journeying, many times they rock. It's also not uncommon at all to hear voices or sounds. Lots of times we will have back hearing singing. I have a drum that I've had for 21 years and I've played it for many circles and many ceremonies. What is very common is for people to hear singing with that drum, or the other sound that comes quite often is the sound of the train, but oftentimes it's voices that they hear or singing that they hear. And I know it comes with other people's drums. I just know that this drum has commonly been able to, maybe it opens that part of the spirit world where people can actually hear singing or hear sounds that they would never hear. Some people even smell specific things or aromas. In the journeys, they may see colorful patterns or symbolic images or dreamlike visions. Some people may find that they have a highly developed inner vision, while others rely more on instinct, intuition, or intent. Because we are such a visual society, we tend to think that everything we experience from a spiritual perspective, especially in the journey state, has to be visual. And that's simply not true. We have many types of clairs. We have clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyance. We have many types of clairs. We can experience the spirit world in many different ways, whether it is kinesthetically, visually, auditorily, from an olfactory perspective. We can experience that part of the brain in another way, that transcendent, that spiritual aspect. Prevalent among the descriptions given of shamanic journeys is that of a tunnel or tube to which the shaman is transported. The tunnel sometimes appears ribbed or may bend or spiral around, and this imagery is associated with the central axis that in turn unites the three different worlds, right? The lower world, the middle world, and the upper world. And often through this tunnel, through this axis, the shaman is conveyed, or you, the journey, are conveyed to up or down the tunnel and then to an exit that opens upon the mystical worlds. In these worlds, you experience sensations, communications that go beyond the usual senses. I have been able to make sounds or do things with my body while in the journey that are being mimicked on my physical body that I cannot recreate when I am in an awake state. One of the experiences I've had is having the opportunity to speak with a blue heron in one of my journeys. And my throat to do gymnastics, physical gymnastics, in order to mimic the sound of the blue heron. And I could feel my throat in the physical world moving and manifesting movement in a way that when I was out of the journey and attempting to recreate the sound and attempting to recreate the muscular gymnastics for my throat, I couldn't. And it wasn't that because I couldn't remember what the sound was. It was because I couldn't make my throat do what it had been doing while I was in that transcendent state. So we access knowledge, power, and healing. And when we finish with our journeys, we return usually via the same way that we went in. Many of my students, and you've heard me talk about this, I even have a guided meditation for the Shaman's Way with respect to the anchor spot. And that for me, like I've explained before, that for me is that boundary place, that transcendent place between the sacred world and the mundane world. And it is that transitional place that reminds the conscious mind, oh, wait a minute, yeah, I am coming back to normal reality. What do I do with this normal reality? So our awareness transcends ordinary reality, which you know. In journeys to the lower world, some people experience a sensation of falling, sliding, or spiraling into or under the earth. In the upper world, sometimes you experience a sensation of rising, floating, flying, spiraling upward through the sky. What I really want to talk about, what's fun for me, is with regard to the horse. Horse has been a part of my journeys for many, many years. And if I were to say to you, remember exactly when I met horse, I remember exactly what horse was like, that would be an absolute untruth, because I don't. But I do remember what happened. I remember picking up a spider, and the spider was so small that I thought, oh, you poor spider, here, let me give you a ride. So I picked the spider up and I put the spider on my shoulder. And the spider thanked me, and in return for aiding the spider then turned into this massive creature, and next thing I knew, I was on the shoulder of the spider, and the spider was able to take me into different places. The next journey that I went on, I was going into the lower world. Now, I've had my many ways of journeying into the lower world over the years, which is kind of funny. So I've gone down tree trunks. I've gone down gopher holes. I've gone down all sorts of ways that are hard to go, tight to go, cold, wet, muddy, etc. And I thought one day, I think I'm going to negotiate about this because I'm not really liking this very much. I want to have an easy entrance into the lower world. We've all seen, or maybe some of us have seen, pedestrian tunnels. So we have a tunnel that a pedestrian will walk under, and then there's a semicircle or a half of a culvert, huge culvert, and on top is a road, or on top is something else. So we're just given a passageway through. My entrance into the lower world looks like that. It's a pedestrian tunnel. And as soon as I enter into the opening of that, particular tunnel, I am greeted by horse. Horse doesn't have a name. Horse is black, as black could be. Horse is huge. And horse bends down, and I put my foot upon its knee, on its bended leg, in order to get up. And then I grab the mane of horse in order to jump on the back. The back of the horse is so large that my legs are spread out like I'm sitting on one of those really, if you're my age and I'm 51, some of us were raised on the farm, and do you remember the propane tanks, those big propane tanks that you would climb up and sit on top of, and they were big metal tubes, and when you're small, how large those things are and how wide your legs go? Well, that's how wide my legs go. It's me into the darker places of the lower world, and is always my companion to ride to the edge of the land of the dead. Now, interestingly enough, I've talked about this before, but horse also rides with 6 black wolves. And over the years, those wolves have grown. So when I first met the wolves, when I stood amongst them, their heads were really at my shoulder. Now, when I am in amongst the wolves and not on the back of horse, my head just barely comes underneath their rib cages. And in some cases, my head is just above the rib cage. So I would be looking right along the bottom of the belly line. And they're not my wolves. They are not my spirit kin. They belong with horse. Horse and the wolves have their own unit, family unit. And the horse is not my power animal. My horse is my helper. And my horse is my friend. So horse has been very instrumental for me over the years. And over the years, I have changed in my relationship with horse. And I realize that horse also is an aspect of my shadow, and an aspect of moving my shadow and moving shadow and working with my own shadow. For horse takes me to the deepest, darkest, most unknown places in the spirit world. And with shadow, I'm working with the deepest, darkest, most unknown aspects of my own psyche, which I find really very fascinating. Now, there is one new addition to horse, and this addition came from a journey that I did with a patient that I had. And during the journey, it was a very precarious, very dangerous journey. And in the journey, myself and a white wolf, which I've never worked with. I don't work with wolves as power animals. And my black jaguar, we all went into the cavern or the underworld below Baba Yaga's house. And Baba Yaga is an old European goddess that deals with death, birth, all sorts of things. Baba Yaga is a fascinating character. So if you ever get the chance to look up Baba Yaga, or you know much about Baba Yaga, you know that the house upon which Baba Yaga stands, or the land upon which it stands, is often considered the entranceway into the land of the dead, or the entranceway into hell, or whatever your mythology takes you to. The point of the story is this. we were able to retrieve the soul piece that was stuck underneath Baba Yaga's house. And that was really a very moving, incredibly difficult journey to do. As a result of that very moving and difficult journey, it also became apparent that we were in quite a bit of danger and really needed to get out of there. So I had the soul piece across my shoulders because the soul piece was truly broken. And I was walking up the stairs. Jaguar was ahead of me, and I turned around and I noticed that the demons, the ghouls, the underworld beings had grabbed Wolf. And one of the very strong lessons that I learned very early on in my experience is that you never leave a power animal behind. You never leave a spirit behind. So I put the body on top of Jaguar and said, "Wait for me here." And I returned into the caverns underneath Baba Yaga's house, and it took 3 tries for me to get the white wolf out. And the very first time I was picking the wolf up, the spirits down there had ripped all the fur off the bottom half of Wolf and dragged Wolf back down into amongst those spirits there. As a result of which, I went back down and I went to go pick up Wolf again, pulled the wolf apart into 2 pieces. So I picked up both pieces of the wolf, and with my magical hands, my shaman hands, was able to put Wolf back together. And then on the 3rd try, they tried to disembowel Wolf, and eventually, after 3 tries, I was able to pick Wolf up. I was able to take Wolf to my healing pond, which is really very close to my anchor spot. And as both of us, because we were both very battered, we were both very bruised, we were both bleeding, as I was in the process of healing, this white wolf healed in the healing pool, grew to be absolutely immense, and jumped over top of me and ran into my entrance of the underworld. The next time I journeyed into my entrance of the underworld. The next time I journeyed, I have to be very honest, when I saw this huge wolf amongst those wolves, horses, wolves, and horse, I was very taken aback, and I didn't really quite know what to do. I know that the spirit world changes all of the time, but when after years of journeying and having very safe set protocols in place, I move into the lower world, I come upon horse, I come upon the wolves, we journey to a place where horse drops me off, and I journey in order to retrieve the soul pieces or do whatever, remove the curse work or whatever I'm doing at that point in time, and then come back. It's very disconcerting to have a new member, and I didn't quite trust this wolf. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, which I won't bore you with those details. But horse has become a very important part to my spirit world. And the other form of horse that I have is Pegasus. And I met Pegasus in one of my journeys shortly after 9/11/2001. So I've been working with Pegasus as well for a good number of years. Between Pegasus and horse, I have been able to travel through the upper worlds and the underworlds and been safe and protected in all of these different realms and these different places. It is important if you have a power animal. One of the things that I would really recommend that you do is I would recommend that you stop in one of your journeys and take note what kin really does look like. I encourage you to see if there are spots under its skin, Or if it's a guide, does your guide have different colored eyes? Does your guide change clothes? Like, pay attention to those details. Once I started paying attention to those details, I found even more richness in my relationship to the spirits. Horse has not changed in its size over the years, but it really has changed the relationship I have with it since I started to realize and recognize that not only is horse an ally in the spirit world, but horse also represents the aspect of my own shadow. And through the years, I have come to love horse. At the same time as I kindly, and sometimes not very gently, learned to love my own shadow, learned to trust my own shadow, in essence, make love to that aspect of myself that we generally find abhorrent, or we generally find out there, or over there, or not in this place. Taking the time to get to know your spirit world has many benefits to you. Horse is an incredible being to work with, and I know that there are many people who have horse as their power animal or their spirit kin, whichever you prefer. Horse is swift, has been used for centuries as a means of traveling, as a means of transportation. But the other aspect that most people aren't aware of is that it took generations for our ancestors to tame and train a horse. And it took many generations of horses for them to build the muscles, the spine, and the genetic transformations it required in order to carry us. Horses were not originally animals put upon this earth to be transportation or carriers for our human bodies. As we change, we often change the world around us. We are engineers of the world around us. We have brought into domestication beautiful horses and have created beautiful and amazing horses. If you are fortunate enough to have horse as your spirit kin or as a power animal, I strongly encourage you to take the time to find out what are horses' favorite foods. What is the speed of horse? Can your horse outrun a wolf? Is your horse related to any other spirit kin? Is your horse just yours, or does your horse travel with other beings or pick up other people in the spirit world as well? Horse is a phenomenal being, and I think that's one of the reasons why the drum is called the horse. See, I made a full circle. You were waiting for it, but I actually did it. So I will leave you with the idea that relationships abound in the spirit world. Relationships with our drum change. Relationships with that auditory, rhythmic, driven sound change. The depth of our journeys change. The ability to stay within the theta state of mind and not drift off into delta also changes. And it also takes discipline. The same as riding a horse in 3D reality requires a lot of discipline and training on your part, as well as discipline and training on the part of the horse. It is that relationship between us and the world around us that creates a healthy, beautiful existence between the place of now and the place of mystery. I wish you a fond time. I know this is being broadcast for the first time on Canada Day, so I encourage you to remember our First Nations that were here, prior to us, and the width, the depth, and the breadth of their knowledge and their ancestry, And as we celebrate the beginning of Canada's roots as a nation 150 years ago, I ask that we remember the thousands of years that the ancestors of this land were here before us. I bid you a fond farewell, and I turn this back to you, my lovely friend Doug.
Thank you again for joining us here on the Shaman's Way podcast. If you have any questions, would like to make a request for a future episode, or if you're looking for other shamanic resources, including free drumming tracks, please visit us at shamansway.net. Until the next episode, be well, everyone.